The attempt to provide a rational explanation for the origin of the cosmos had long occupied the earliest Greek thinkers, from Thales to Diogenes of Apollonia. In contrast to these predecessors, Plato largely refrained from addressing this question until late in his life, when he offered his own account of the universe's creation in the extended myth narrated by Timaeus in the dialogue bearing his name. It is striking that this late work, intended as the first part of an unfinished trilogy, became one of the most influential of all his writings, particularly in the Latin-speaking West, where it was the only Platonic text to survive throughout the Middle Ages in translation. In more recent scholarship, however, the philosophical status of the Timaeus has been the subject of considerable debate. Some have questioned its consistency with other late dialogues, such as the Parmenides, Theaetetus, and Sophist, leading to the suggestion that it might instead belong to an earlier phase of Plato's development. Others have proposed that the cosmological account it contains should not be taken as expressing Plato's own views, but rather those of its speaker, understood as a representative of a broader philosophical tradition, often associated with Pythagorean thought. A further point of contention concerns whether the cosmology of the Timaeus should be interpreted metaphorically or literally. The metaphorical approach, favored by many ancient commentators and later scholars, seeks to resolve apparent inconsistencies by reading the narrative symbolically. The literal approach, by contrast, treats the account as a genuine description of cosmic processes and tends to explain discrepancies with other dialogues as evidence of a development in Plato's thinking. These interpretative disputes, however, are not central to the present discussion. Instead, attention is directed toward the origins of the creation narrative itself. By examining its mythological and literary background, it becomes possible to trace many of its most distinctive features back to earlier traditions, particularly those associated with Orphic accounts of divine generation. A similar method can be applied to other cosmological myths within Plato's works, such as the account of Cronus in the Statesman, in order to evaluate how these narratives relate to and align with the broader cosmological vision presented in the Timaeus. The problem of the world's origin occupied Greek thought from its earliest beginnings, with Hesiod's Theogony establishing a model that shaped later accounts, whether mythological or philosophical. Within this long tradition, Plato's Timaeus stands apart as the first narrative to present the creation of the universe as the result of deliberate and intelligent design, carried out by a benevolent and all-powerful divine craftsman. The notable resemblance between this account and the creation story found in Genesis later contributed to its exceptional authority among early and medieval Christian thinkers, though it also led some classical scholars to view its seemingly monotheistic tendencies as at odds with the broader Greek tradition. Yet, although certain features of the Timaeus appear unconventional when compared with more familiar Greek cosmogonies, they are not without precedent. Many of these distinctive elements can already be found, at least in a preliminary form, within the cosmogonic myths associated with the Orphic tradition. A closer examination of these parallels reveals that Plato's account did not emerge in isolation, but rather developed out of earlier mythological frameworks. Alongside Hesiod's version, Greek tradition preserved a range of alternative theogonic and cosmological narratives, most of which survive only in fragments transmitted by later authors. Among these were several hexametric poems attributed to figures such as Orpheus and Musaeus, to which Plato himself alludes on multiple occasions, including within the Timaeus. In that dialogue, the speaker refers, somewhat ironically, to the authority of those said to be descended from the gods, who recounted the origins of divine beings. These Orphic compositions shared certain structural similarities with Hesiod's account, yet they also introduced elements absent from it, features that caused them to be regarded as unusual or marginal. Although they were neither secret nor entirely obscure, by Plato's time they had come to occupy a peripheral position in Greek culture, which helps explain why Hesiod's poem has survived intact while these alternative traditions have not. Rather than attempting to reconstruct these lost texts in detail or to trace their broader influences, attention can instead be directed toward particular themes within the Orphic cosmogonic tradition and their reception in Plato's work. When viewed from this perspective, the Timaeus reveals its most distinctive innovation, the central role of an intelligent cause, represented by the demiurge, as the guiding force behind the formation of the cosmos. This marks a decisive departure both from Hesiod's model of generative succession and from the presocratic tendency to explain the universe through purely material or mechanical processes. Plato himself had already expressed dissatisfaction with earlier philosophical approaches in the Phaedo, where Socrates recounts his disappointment with thinkers who failed to give a proper account of intelligence as a causal principle. Even Anaxagoras, who had posited intellect as fundamental, was criticized for not adequately explaining how it orders the world, instead attributing causal responsibility to physical elements such as air and water. According to this critique, earlier philosophers had confused true causation with the mere conditions that make causation possible, mistaking material factors for the ultimate explanation. What was lacking in these earlier accounts was a teleological understanding of the universe, an explanation grounded in purpose and directed toward what is best for all things. This deficiency is precisely what Plato seeks to remedy in the Timaeus, where the cosmos is presented as the product of rational design, guided by intelligence and oriented toward order and goodness. The Timaeus is widely regarded as an unusual dialogue. Much of it is devoted to a mythical account of the origin of the physical universe, yet its opening reveals that this narrative is only the first of 3 speeches intended to be delivered by Socrates' interlocutors, either across separate works or, as some scholars maintain, within a single unified composition. The initial impetus for the discussion is not cosmology itself, but a prior speech by Socrates concerning the ideal state. Socrates considers that account incomplete because it portrays the ideal city in a static condition, whereas he would prefer to see it engaged in rivalry with other cities, competing for the kinds of honors that typically arise between political communities. Admitting his own inability to construct such a dynamic image, Socrates calls upon his interlocutors, who he judges to be the only suitable contributors for this task, namely those who combine political and philosophical expertise. In this arrangement, Critias is assigned the role of recounting how ancient Athens, many millennia earlier, repelled the invasion of Atlantis. Hermocrates, possibly identifiable with the Syracusan general associated with the defeat of the Athenians during the Sicilian expedition, may have been expected to describe the inevitable decline of cities and the contemporary degradation of Athens in comparison with its ancient rival. Before Critias can fully present his narrative, however, the Locrian thinker Timaeus is invited to offer an account of the universe itself, beginning with its origin and continuing through to the emergence of humanity. At first sight, the political framing of the Timaeus may appear unexpected, yet it is consistent with Plato's broader philosophical outlook. Cosmology and political theory are both situated within a shared teleological and theological structure, in which the ultimate aim is the improvement and purification of the human soul. Within this framework, statesmen and lawgivers occupy a role analogous to that of divine intelligence. Just as the divine intellect orders the cosmos and creates the optimal conditions for the flourishing of souls, political leaders are responsible for establishing and preserving similar conditions within the city or state. On this basis, it is entirely appropriate for Plato to bring together cosmological and political discourse, as he does not only in the Timaeus but also in the Statesman, in the final book of the Laws, and in certain respects in the myth of air in the concluding book of the Republic. Since cosmology, like eschatology, lies beyond the strict limits of dialectical reasoning, Plato frequently turns to mythic expression when addressing such subjects. The rationale for this approach is set out in the methodological passage that introduces Timaeus' speech, where it is explained that discourse must correspond to the nature of its subject. Accounts concerning what is stable, intelligible, and grasped by intellect must themselves aspire to stability and precision, whereas accounts concerning what is a mere likeness can only achieve probable truth. In this way, the relation between being and becoming mirrors that between truth and belief. For this reason, Socrates is cautioned not to expect absolute consistency or complete accuracy in what follows, but to accept explanations that are as plausible as possible. Both speaker and audience, it is emphasized, share a common human condition, and therefore can only aim at accounts appropriate to that limitation. Any account concerning the nature of the universe and its origin can be considered plausible only in a limited sense, because its subject matter is itself only an approximation, a mere likeness of a perfect model. As is made clear in the famous analogy of the line in the Republic, only the realm of forms, the things that truly are, can be the object of knowledge in the strict sense, whereas everything that belongs to the sensible order falls instead under belief or persuasion. In addition, human cognitive limitations prevent any complete grasp or fully adequate explanation of these realities, at least when compared with what a divine and omniscient intellect might achieve, especially in relation to the works of divine intelligence. For this reason, in matters of cosmology and natural science, one should not expect explanations that are perfectly coherent or beyond dispute, but rather accounts that are no less plausible than any other. A similar idea is expressed by Socrates at the conclusion of the eschatological myth in the Phaedo, where it is stated that a person of understanding should not insist that such accounts are exactly as described, yet it is fitting and even worthwhile to maintain that something like them is true regarding the soul and its dwelling places, since the risk is noble. Plato therefore treats these mythical accounts as deserving serious attention, even though their subject matter cannot be assessed according to the strict standards of dialectical certainty. What might appear as a limitation from the perspective of rigorous logical or scientific explanation instead becomes, for Plato, a productive freedom. It allows him to construct a narrative that is not only philosophically suggestive but also poetically powerful, capable of challenging both the presocratic natural philosophers and Hesiod's traditional cosmogony. In doing so, he combines his own philosophical positions with selected ideas drawn from earlier thinkers, while also incorporating elements of the Orphic tradition, which had already played a significant role in shaping his eschatological imagery and his understanding of the soul and human nature. At the center of the Timaeus stands the figure of a divine craftsman, referred to as the demiurge. Like any artisan, this divine maker does not bring the cosmos into being from nothing, but instead shapes pre-existing material according to an intelligible design. Consistent with a metaphor of craftsmanship, the demiurge models his work on an eternal paradigm, since the universe, as the most beautiful of all generated things, must be fashioned after what is unchanging. The existence of a creator, together with the material and model required for creation, is presented as almost self-evident. Whatever comes into being must do so through some cause, and this cause is understood to be an intelligent being. Such a position, however, was not widely accepted, as it stands in opposition both to the materialist explanations of the atomists and earlier natural philosophers, and to the Hesiodic tradition grounded in biological generation. The closest antecedents to the idea of an intelligent creator in Greek thought are found in the Orphic writers, whose works were later frequently invoked by Neoplatonist interpreters in support of their reading of Platonic cosmology. A distinctive characteristic of Orphic accounts of cosmic origin is the combination of two different models of creation. On the one hand, there is the biomorphic model, in which the universe comes into being through the successive generation and union of divine beings, in a manner comparable to Hesiod's theogony. On the other hand, there is the technomorphic model, in which the cosmos is intentionally produced by a divine craftsman acting as an artisan, as in the Babylonian Enuma Elish or the biblical book of Genesis. In the rhapsodic theogony, the most recent and best documented of the Orphic theogonies, the firstborn deity, known under names such as Protagonos and Phans, is itself produced biomorphically from an egg fashioned out of ether by Cronus. At the same time, this deity is already engaged in technomorphic activity as a cosmic maker. He constructs an eternal dwelling for the gods, produces another earth that is inaccessible and known among the immortals as Selene and among human beings as Mean, and establishes the sun as a guardian, assigning it the role of universal ruler. The creative activity of Phans, who brings forth the cosmos from primordial chaos, anticipates a second act of creation carried out by Zeus, the final ruler in the Orphic sequence. This narrative, central to Orphic tradition, appears in several poetic forms over time, including the Orphic compositions cited in the Davini Papyrus and the so-called hymn to Zeus preserved in the Pseudo-Aristotelian De Mundo, later expanded in the Rhapsodies. According to the account in the Rhapsodies, Zeus, following the Council of Night, swallows Phans along with his entire creation, whose generative seeds he contains within himself. As a result, all things that had already come into being and all that would come to be are reconstituted within Zeus himself, becoming unified within his being. Through this assimilation, Zeus becomes both last and first. Within him beginning, middle, and end are unified. This idea is reflected in a well-known Orphic verse cited by Plato in the Laws, where reference is made to a god who holds together the beginning, the end, and the middle of all things. An ancient commentator identifies the Orphic origin of this verse and reproduces it in the form: Zeus is the beginning, Zeus is the middle, and from Zeus all things are made. Variants of this formulation appear not only in the Rhapsodies, but also in the poem preserved in the Derveni papyrus, suggesting that the figure of Phans and his initial act of creation were already present in Orphic traditions circulating in the classical period, even if they are explicitly attested only in later sources. Clear parallels can be drawn between Phans, Zeus, and the demiurge of the Timaeus. All three figures are engaged in purposeful acts of creation, expressed through a combination of biomorphic and technomorphic imagery. Each also creates not from nothing but from pre-existing material: Phans from primordial elements, Zeus from the creation of Phans, and the Platonic demiurge from the receptacle, a chaotic material substratum described as eternal and indestructible. Furthermore, the withdrawal of the demiurge after the creation of subordinate gods, who are then entrusted with the formation of living beings, finds a parallel in the Orphic narrative in which Phans, after completing his cosmic work, retires and transfers authority to night. Such correspondences did not escape the attention of Neoplatonic commentators, who sought to identify even further similarities between Orphic cosmogony and Plato's account. Within this interpretative tradition, Cronus of the Rhapsodies was associated with the Platonic One, understood as the first principle from which all reality proceeds. Ether and chaos, or chasm, both generated by Cronus, were later interpreted in allegorical terms as corresponding to limit and the unlimited. In this interpretive framework, the cosmic egg produced from ether and chaos was understood as a metaphor for intelligible being. Within the egg, all parts remain undifferentiated, with no separation of head and foot, and in the same way the intelligible realm contains all forms in an undivided state, unified with one another. Phans, who emerges from the egg, was taken to represent the living being, which in Plato's Timaeus functions as the model for the demiurge's creative activity. The physical characteristics attributed to Phans in the Orphic tradition were also read symbolically. His hermaphroditic nature was interpreted as indicating that the living being contains within itself the potential seeds of sexual differentiation while remaining fundamentally unified, expressing the idea that multiplicity exists within unity. The Orphic Zeus, who consumes Phans along with his creation, was correspondingly identified with the Platonic demiurge, who becomes filled with the forms through contemplation of the model. In this allegorical reading, all things come to exist within Zeus after the swallowing of Phans, since what appears first in unified form in Phans appears again in differentiated form within the demiurge. What is unified at an initial stage becomes articulated into plurality at a secondary stage. Although such Neoplatonic allegorical interpretations have not been widely accepted in modern scholarship, their approach is not without relevance, since it reflects a broader ancient tendency to use Orphic mythology to illuminate Platonic metaphysics. This practice gains additional plausibility from Plato's own engagement with Orphic material. In the case of the Timaeus, the similarities between the demiurge and the Orphic figures of Zeus and Phans are strengthened by the absence of any clear alternative model in earlier Greek thought for a purposeful, intelligent creator. Some parallels, however, are less secure. For example, the resemblance between the spherical cosmic egg in Orphic tradition and the ordered cosmos in the Timaeus may be less decisive, given that comparable images can also be found in other pre-Socratic sources such as Parmenides and Empedocles. Likewise, the possible presence of necessity among the primordial powers in Orphic theogonies cannot be confirmed with certainty in the surviving early evidence. Even so, the broader pattern suggests that Plato was not merely aware of Orphic cosmotheogonic traditions, but was significantly influenced by them, both in narrative structure and in deeper philosophical orientation. This influence is most evident in the shared attempt to address the problem of the one and the many, which dominated Greek thought in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. In contrast to natural philosophers who relied on mechanistic explanations, both Plato and the Orphic tradition propose a theological framework centered on a single intelligent principle from which all reality derives. Within Orphic thought, this principle was naturally associated with Zeus, the highest deity of the Greek pantheon. Yet this created tension with traditional myth, in which Zeus rules the cosmos but does not originate all things. To resolve this, Orphic authors introduced a primordial creator figure, Phans the firstborn, and employed the motif of divine ingestion, in which Zeus absorbs Phans and his creative power. Through this act, Zeus unites within himself both creative and ruling functions. As noted earlier, Plato's own treatment of cosmology similarly integrates creation with broader questions of order and governance, embedding cosmological themes within discussions of political structure and intelligible design, as also seen in dialogues where mythic accounts of cosmic intervention are framed alongside analyses of the statesman. There are multiple ingestion myths in both Greek and Near Eastern traditions, but the closest parallel to the swallowing of Phans, if one assumes that early versions of the Orphic cosmogony already included the episode later transmitted in the Rhapsodies, can be found in Hesiod's Theogony. In that work, Zeus is described as ingesting the goddess of wisdom Metis, a figure with whom Phans is identified in the rhapsodic tradition. In a related allegorical reading of the Orphic Theogony, the author of the Derveni Papyrus interprets Zeus's act of swallowing as a symbolic representation of the divine intellect mastering the power of the sun. This interpretation relies on the ambiguity of a term meaning venerable, which can also function as a noun meaning genitals or phallus. Although the plural form of this usage appears already in Homer, the singular form is later and not attested in poetic contexts. Within this interpretive framework, Orpheus is said to have called the god who first emerged into ether, identified as the firstborn, by this term in order to liken him, and by extension the sun with which he is associated, to a phallus, since human beings understand generation as originating in the genitals. This allegorical reading has been defended by several modern scholars, while others argue instead that the Orphic verse preserved in the Derveni Papyrus refers to Zeus swallowing an actual phallus, most likely that of Uranus. On this view, the term firstborn king is not an epithet of Phans, but refers to the god whose severed member is consumed by Zeus. A further proposal attempts to reconcile these positions by suggesting that the swallower in the earliest episode is Cronus rather than Zeus, since a direct sequence from castration to swallowing would be chronologically inconsistent. In this interpretation, Cronus' act anticipates Zeus's later ingestion of Phans, while the firstborn king refers to Phans himself. The idea that the ruler of the universe is also its creator represents a significant innovation within Orphic thought. Even more importantly, the image of a single god who at one point contains the entire cosmos within himself serves as a powerful metaphor for the unity of multiplicity. This conceptual unity is echoed in Platonic philosophy through the idea of the cosmic soul, understood as an all-encompassing ordering principle that mediates between the realms of being and becoming. Unlike cosmology, classical Greece did not preserve a single authoritative account of the origin of humankind. Instead, multiple anthropogonic traditions coexisted without a unified framework. Local myths, such as those of Theban and Athenian autochthony, existed alongside Panhellenic narratives like Hesiod's account of the 5 ages of humanity, without any overarching synthesis. Plato himself reflects this plurality by presenting different and mutually incompatible versions of human origins across his dialogues, each drawing on well-known figures and motifs from Greek anthropogonic tradition. Alongside these, he also offers a universal account of human origins within the broader cosmological structure of the Timaeus, and it is this later version that appears to carry the greatest philosophical authority. The absence of a Greek equivalent to the story of Adam and Eve is likely connected to the fragmented political structure of archaic and classical Greece, in which city-states and aristocratic families promoted their own foundation myths as a means of legitimizing power and prestige. Even in Hesiod, narratives concerning the first woman and the ages of man are not primarily concerned with explaining human origins in themselves, but rather with interpreting aspects of the present human condition, such as marriage or the transition from a warrior society to an agricultural one. The Anthropogony of the Timaeus retains certain familiar features from earlier tradition. As in the myth of Pandora, the gods engage in a technomorphic act of creation, shaping human bodies from the 4 elemental components of fire, air, water, and earth. In addition, creation is carried out by younger, generated gods acting under the directives of the demiurge, in a manner comparable to Hesiod's version in which Zeus delegates the creation of the first woman to his offspring rather than performing the act himself. Despite these continuities, the Timaeus introduces a fundamentally different conception of human nature. It presents humanity as composite, consisting of distinct elements with separate origins, the immortal soul on one side, and the body together with the mortal soul on the other. No comparable distinction between body and soul appears in traditional anthropogonic myths. This difference is unsurprising, since the idea of the soul as an independent entity, separable from the body, represents a relatively recent development, closely associated with the emergence of Orphic thought. It is therefore necessary to consider whether such a conception is also present in the Orphic myth of human origins. The antiquity, and even the existence, of an Orphic anthropogony remains a subject of scholarly debate, largely because the only complete version of the myth survives in a much later source. Some scholars have suggested that an alternative Orphic account of human origin, and possibly of cosmogony as well, may have been transmitted in an Orphic poem known as Physica or Periphysios, in which Titans may have been absent and the Tritopators may have played a significant role. This poem appears to combine a theory of the soul with elements of presocratic physical doctrine, a feature that has been used to support a dating to the late 5th century before the Common Era. The passage in question is taken from a commentary on Plato's Phaedo written by the Neoplatonist Olympiodorus, who refers to the Orphic narrative of Dionysus and the Titans in connection with the prohibition of suicide mentioned in the dialogue. According to this account, the Orphics say that Dionysus was, through the scheming of Hera, torn apart by the Titans, his attendants, who also consumed his flesh. In response, Zeus in his anger struck the Titans with his thunderbolts, and from the soot produced by the vapors rising from there remains the material from which humanity was formed originated. For this reason, human beings must not kill themselves, not because, as the text might appear to suggest, the soul is imprisoned in the body as in a form of bondage, but because this idea is already obvious and would not be presented by Plato as a secret doctrine. The deeper reason is that human bodies are Dionysian in nature. Human beings belong to Dionysus, since they are formed from the soot of the Titans who consumed his flesh. In this interpretation, Olympiodorus distinguishes between two levels of meaning. The first, more obvious and exoteric explanation for the Orphic prohibition of suicide is the belief, also found in Plato, that the soul is confined within the body as a form of punishment, and that it is therefore wrong to seek escape through self-inflicted death. The second, more hidden and esoteric explanation concerns the original cause of this confinement, namely the myth transmitted in the Mysteries about the killing and dismemberment of Dionysus by the Titans. The secrecy surrounding this myth likely explains why no sources from before the Hellenistic period refer to it explicitly, even though authors such as Plato appear to know it in some form. Because of this restricted transmission, it is difficult to determine how much of Olympiodorus' account reflects earlier Orphic tradition and how much derives from his own interpretation. The core narrative, in which humanity's mortal condition is linked to the crime of the Titans against Dionysus, is nevertheless attested in several earlier authors, including Proclus, Plutarch, and possibly Dio Chrysostom, and is also implicitly reflected in a well-known fragment of Pindar preserved by Plato. For many scholars, this provides sufficient grounds to posit an early origin for the myth. At the same time, Olympiodorus introduces a distinctive interpretative claim not clearly found elsewhere, namely that because the Titans consumed Dionysus, the material from which human bodies are formed, derived from the Titans' ashes, is not purely Titanic but also partly Dionysian. His interpretation of the Orphic ban on suicide presupposes and revises what may be considered a more conventional reading of the Anthropogony. On this standard view, human beings combine two opposing natures, a mortal and inherently negative component associated with the body, and a divine and inherently positive component associated with the soul. The divine element is traced back to Dionysus, while the mortal element derives from the Titans who devoured him. This interpretation is explicitly reported by Olympiodorus elsewhere in his commentary, as well as by other Neoplatonic authors, and can be traced back at least to Xenocrates, who describes the body as a kind of prison as being titanic in nature and as ultimately deriving from Dionysus. Plato's own position is more ambiguous. In a debated passage of the Laws, he characterizes those guilty of the gravest offenses against divine law as embodying what is described as an ancient titanic nature. This expression has traditionally been interpreted as an allusion to the Orphic myth of Dionysus and the Titans. However, some scholars have argued that the portrayal of ancient gods as rebellious and violent already belongs to the wider mythological tradition, most clearly represented by the Titanomachy in Hesiod's Theogony. In response to such objections, defenders of the Orphic interpretation have pointed to a related passage in Plato's Laws, which is taken to support an Orphic background. In that passage, Plato describes the impulse driving sacrilegious behavior as an evil that is neither of human nor divine origin, but rather an innate force implanted in human beings through ancient and unpurified acts of wrongdoing. Other scholars have suggested that such language need not presuppose an Orphic reference. It could instead be explained through more general mythological concepts, such as the Erinyes or similar divine agents who drive individuals toward destructive actions as a consequence of unresolved ancestral crimes. On this reading, these forces would also belong to the category of the demonic, being neither fully human nor fully divine, so that an explicit reference to the Titans would not be necessary. Nevertheless, if Plato had intended to refer specifically to the Erinyes, there would have been no reason to avoid naming them directly. By contrast, any explicit mention of the Orphic myth of the Titans would have been constrained by religious restrictions on revealing mystery traditions outside their proper context. For this reason, the most plausible interpretation is that Plato may be drawing simultaneously on both mainstream mythological ideas and Orphic traditions, assuming an audience familiar with both frameworks. In any case, even if these passages are connected to the Orphic Anthropogony, they do not explicitly confirm either of its main interpretations. Neither the standard view, according to which the human soul is Dionysian and imprisoned within a titanic body, nor the alternative view, which sees both soul and body as containing elements of both Dionysian and titanic nature. What they do confirm, at minimum, is the extreme moral depravity traditionally attributed to the Titans, a notion that Orphic tradition intensifies to its most radical form. Mainstream myth and cult generally emphasize the separation between gods and humans in the present age, while also maintaining that both ultimately originated from the same source, without clearly explaining humanity's degraded condition. Orphic mythmakers developed this framework further by taking the Titans, already loosely connected with human origins, and assigning them responsibility for the most extreme form of impiety, the ritual killing and consumption of the divine child and heir of the supreme god. In this reinterpretation, humanity is not simply the flawed creation of a deity, as in Hesiod's myth of the races, but the product of a union between two fundamentally opposed principles, the celestial nature of Dionysus and the chaotic, chthonic nature of the Titans. From the Titans, human beings inherit the guilt of divine murder, for which they are punished by exclusion from the divine realm. At the same time, because of their shared origin with Dionysus and the other Olympian gods, human beings retain the possibility of purification and redemption. Through ritual initiation and purification, they may atone for their ancestral guilt and hope for a return to a divine condition after death. In this framework, Orphic practitioners could understand themselves as exiled or fallen divinities. As the gold tablets suggest, they identified with the Dionysian, heavenly aspect of their nature and believed that, once purified from titanic pollution through initiation, they would recover their true divine identity in the afterlife. This concludes the so-called standard version of the Orphic Anthropogony. Returning to Olympiodorus' interpretation, his claim that the human body contains a divine element is notable in several respects. On one hand, it stands in tension with the Neoplatonic tendency to depreciate the body, a view that the Orphic tradition itself is often thought to share. On the other hand, the opposite implication, that the soul itself contains a titanic element, fits more closely with the Platonic conception of the soul as composite, including both a mortal, irrational aspect and an immortal, rational aspect that defines its essence. Although Olympiodorus does not explicitly formulate this idea, it is strongly suggested in Plutarch's De Sucanium, where the name Titans is etymologically interpreted as those who pay the penalty. In that passage, human souls are described as being imprisoned in mortal bodies as punishment for acts such as murder, consumption of animal flesh, and cannibalism. Plutarch further suggests that this doctrine is even older, linking it to stories about the dismemberment of Dionysus and the crimes committed by the Titans against him, followed by their punishment through thunderbolt after consuming his blood. These myths, he explains, are in their deeper meaning concerned with reincarnation. Within this framework, the irrational, disorderly, and violent aspect within human beings, neither fully divine nor purely human but demonic, is what the ancients called titans, understood as that which is subject to punishment and retribution. In this way, Plutarch appears to attribute to Orphic mythmakers a conception of the soul as containing an irrational, demonic component, which explains its confinement within the body. While this interpretation is grounded in Platonic psychology, it would be significant if early Orphic thinkers indeed held similar views, as this would indicate a possible Orphic influence on Plato's theory of the composite soul. Although a dualistic division between soul and body is generally characteristic of Orphic tradition, the idea that the soul itself may contain a titanic element arising from primordial guilt is also compatible with the broader Orphic understanding of the body as a prison. If the soul were entirely pure and divine in nature, it would be difficult to account for its punishment and incarnation. By contrast, Olympiodorus' suggestion that the body contains a divine Dionysian element because of the Titan's consumption of Dionysus' flesh appears to be foreign to both Platonic and Orphic doctrine. This likely explains why it is presented as part of a hidden or esoteric interpretation. In summary, both Plato's Anthropogony in the Timaeus and the Orphic account of human origins diverge from earlier traditional myths in that they present human nature as composite, consisting of a morally superior and a morally inferior element with distinct origins. In both systems, the mortal aspect of humanity is not directly created by the highest divine principle, although its role differs in each case. In the Orphic narrative, human creation is effectively incidental. While Zeus deliberately creates and orders the cosmos according to a plan, humanity arises as an unintended consequence of his punishment of the Titans for their murder of his son. Zeus is thus directly responsible only for the emergence of the human soul, derived from Dionysus, while the human body arises indirectly from the destruction of the Titans, who are responsible for the conditions that made embodied existence necessary. In the Timaeus myth, the creation of mortal human beings is not accidental, but part of a deliberate cosmic plan. The existence of every kind of living creature is necessary for the completeness and perfection of the universe, since a world without them would be incomplete. At the beginning of the dialogue, Plato stresses that the demiurge, being good and free from jealousy, desires his creation to be as perfect as possible, reflecting his own nature. Because everything produced directly by the demiurge is imperishable and cannot be destroyed except by its maker, the formation of the human body and of the mortal parts of the soul is assigned to the created gods. The demiurge himself is responsible only for the immortal soul. Without necessarily attributing the same intentions to Orphic tradition, it is still possible to recognize in Orphic Anthropogony a symbolic expression of a key idea in the Timaeus, namely, that the mortal and immortal aspects of human nature must be understood as distinct realities with different origins and different creators. This interpretation was also developed by Neoplatonic commentators, who identified the Orphic Dionysus with Plato's cosmic soul and understood his dismemberment as a symbolic fragmentation of that soul throughout the physical cosmos and into individual human bodies. This reading appears in the versions of the myth transmitted by Damascius and Olympiodorus, and possibly in a variant preserved in a Sibylline oracle from Perinthos dating to the 2nd century of the Common Era. In another variant of the tradition, attested in a small number of later sources, human beings are said to originate from the blood of titans or giants, figures often conflated in the Hellenistic period, that was spilled upon the earth during their conflict with the gods. In his commentary on Plato's Republic, Proclus presents yet another version of the Orphic Anthropogony, according to which Zeus put together the present human race from the dismembered limbs of the Titans. Although in the Rhapsodies the earlier generations of humanity are described as intentionally created by Phanes and Cronus respectively, Proclus' version appears to adapt the Orphic narrative to the model of the Timaeus, where the same verb meaning, to put together, is used to describe the demiurge's creative activity. Unlike Plato, Orphic mythmakers do not avoid attributing morally questionable actions to divine figures, as seen in the role of Hera as instigator of Dionysus' murder. At the same time, there may still be an underlying concern that the ultimate creator and ruler of the universe should not be associated with imperfection or moral fault. If an early form of the Orphic myth is accepted, as it reasonably can be, it is therefore plausible that Plato was influenced by this idea in shaping his own account. Before concluding, another important parallel between Orphic anthropogony and Plato's account should be noted, namely their close relationship with eschatological thought. Both systems present human beings as, in essence, imperfect or fallen divinities, and both orient their teachings toward the possibility of transcending the mortal condition and attaining immortality, understood as a return to the divine state. In each case, the solution to the problem of incarnation is already embedded in the circumstances of human origin. In Orphic tradition, Dionysus, as the source of the divine element in the soul, provides the possibility of redemption through initiation into his mysteries. In the Timaeus, the demiurge assigns each soul to a star and imparts knowledge of cosmic order and destiny, enabling it to pursue a philosophical life oriented toward the good and eventually to be freed from the cycle of reincarnations. As the text describes, after forming the souls, the demiurge distributes them among the stars, shows them the structure of the universe, and reveals the laws of destiny. Those who live well are destined to return to their originating star and enjoy a blessed existence suited to their nature. This teaching, reaffirmed at the end of the Timaeus, is consistent with earlier Platonic dialogues concerning the fate of the soul after death, especially the Phaedrus. This section of the Timaeus is presented as a kind of prelude to the eschatological myth in the Phaedrus, where the chariot allegory is explicitly evoked. In that dialogue, the procession of souls in the Hyperuranian realm is described, along with the fall of human souls due to their imperfect nature and their subsequent fate governed by the law of adrastia. The difficulty raised by the Phaedrus myth, namely, that it depicts an original fall of the soul without clearly explaining its cause, is addressed in the creation account of the Timaeus. There, it is explained that human souls are produced by design in order to descend to earth and inhabit physical bodies for a limited period of time. An important divergence emerges here between Plato's view, at least as expressed in the Timaeus, and that of the Orphic tradition. Whereas Orphic thought tends to interpret the first incarnation of the soul as a form of punishment, Plato instead presents it as an integral and necessary component of the divine plan governing the cosmos. This does not mean that Plato rejects the generally negative assessment of incarnation shared with the Orphics, especially regarding the body and embodied existence. Rather, incarnation is treated as a necessary condition of the cosmic order, a kind of unavoidable imperfection that the benevolent Creator seeks to regulate and minimize as far as possible. After bringing the cosmos into being and assigning to the lesser gods the task of producing all mortal living beings, including humans, the god of the Timaeus withdraws from direct involvement and continues to abide by the character of his own nature. The phrase used in this passage is difficult to interpret precisely, but its general meaning suggests that the demiurge leaves the formation of mortal beings to the younger gods and does not intervene further in their creation. In accordance with this, the demiurge is mentioned in the remainder of the dialogue only in relation to the works of reason described earlier, which include the instructions given to the subordinate gods concerning the creation of mortal bodies. Given that many thinkers who influenced Plato, including Hesiod, Heraclitus, and Empedocles, held some form of cyclical cosmology, it is natural to ask whether Plato himself considered the universe eternal. If so, the creation narrative in the Timaeus would need to be understood as purely symbolic. Alternatively, one might suppose that the demiurge periodically brings the cosmos to an end and initiates a new cycle. Although Plato never explicitly endorses either position, various indications suggest that the latter interpretation may be more plausible. Some scholars interpret the passage describing the demiurge's withdrawal as a literal statement that he remains in his customary mode of existence, while others take it as an affirmation of divine immutability. This raises a philosophical tension. If creative activity belongs to the nature of the demiurge, would its cessation imply a departure from his essential character? One resolution is to understand the demiurge not as a literal agent, but as a mythic representation of rational causality. A parallel has also been drawn with the Orphic rhapsodies, where Phanes, after creating the cosmos, transfers authority to night. However, in that tradition Phanes also creates the first generation of humans before withdrawing from active rule. If this earliest human race is understood as analogous to Hesiod's golden race, Then a further comparison can be made with the Timaeus, in which the rational component of the human soul is directly fashioned by the demiurge. In both cases, a higher divine principle is responsible for the most elevated aspect of human nature, while subsequent developments are entrusted to subordinate powers. This raises a further question concerning Plato's conception of cosmic temporality. Influenced by earlier thinkers such as Heraclitus, Hesiod, and Empedocles, who all proposed some form of cyclical structure to the universe, it is possible that Plato also envisioned the cosmos as subject to periodic renewal. Alternative interpretations include the idea of a universe that has a beginning but no end, or one that is everlasting but not strictly eternal. However, this latter possibility is excluded by the Timaeus, where it is stated that the sensible cosmos, being visible and tangible, belongs to the realm of becoming and is therefore generated and not fully eternal. Plato further explains that, since it is impossible for a generated entity to be eternal, the demiurge creates time itself as a moving image of eternity, allowing the cosmos to exist within a temporal framework that mirrors eternal being. Within this structure, the universe can be described as everlasting in its ordered motion, even if time itself may not possess absolute eternity. Within the Timaeus itself, the destruction of the universe is presented as a real possibility on at least two separate occasions. In another passage, God is described through his capacity to blend the many into one and to dissolve again the one into many, a formulation that appears to point to two complementary and opposing processes, creation and destruction. In addition, Plato's discussion of the so-called perfect year raises further cosmological implications. This period is completed when all the planets return to the same relative positions, measured through the revolution of the same and the similar. The question naturally arises whether the completion of this planetary cycle also entails the end of time itself and, consequently, the destruction of the universe, since time and cosmos were brought into being together. Although Plato does not explicitly link the completion of the perfect year with a cosmic catastrophe, later testimony suggests that such an idea was not foreign to ancient cosmological thought. Seneca reports that the Babylonian priest and astronomer Berossus, active in the early 3rd century before the Common Era, taught a doctrine of recurring cosmic cycles marked by repeated universal conflagrations. This doctrine, as transmitted, involves patterns of recurrence and counter-recurrence that resemble, in a limited way, the two-cycle cosmology presented in the myth of the Statesman. Even though there is no definitive evidence in Plato's writings for a fully developed theory of eternal recurrence, later authors such as Eusebius of Caesarea nonetheless attributed such a view to him, drawing on the myth of Cronus in the Statesman as supporting evidence. Since this is the only Platonic passage where cosmic cyclicity is discussed in detail, it deserves close attention. The cosmological myth in the Statesman offers a distinctive account of divine intervention in the direction of the universe's rotation, a passage that has generated extensive scholarly debate. The present condition of the cosmos, in which it rotates from east to west and earthly beings undergo decay and corruption, arises, by necessity, from the influence of the corporeal aspect of the cosmic mixture, from which the universe is formed. This bodily element naturally tends toward disorder. At certain intervals, the divine power assumes direct control of the cosmos and reverses its rotation. According to tradition, such reversals occurred during the reign of Cronus and again in the time of Atrus. Since time itself, as the Timaeus explains, is bound to the movement of the heavens, a reversal of cosmic motion entails a reversal of temporal conditions as well. Plato describes the consequences of such a reversal in vivid terms. The aging process of living beings comes to a halt, and all mortal creatures begin to grow younger instead of older. The white hair of the elderly darkens, and their bearded faces become smooth again, restoring them to youth. The bodies of young people shrink and become increasingly childlike in form, both physically and mentally, until they ultimately regress into infancy. This process continues until beings gradually fade away entirely. In the same reversal, those who are dead and buried in the earth are described as returning to life, since generation itself is inverted along with the cosmic rotation. For this reason, they are called earthborn, and this name is explained through this tradition. It is understandable how Christian interpreters such as Eusebius, and possibly Stoic thinkers who developed doctrines of eternal recurrence, could interpret this alternating cosmic motion as implying an endless repetition of identical events across successive cycles. This reading does not necessarily reflect Plato's own intention, nor is it required for the present analysis. However, the very existence of such interpretations shows that the weaker version of cosmic cyclicity, according to which the universe undergoes recurring but non-identical macrocycles punctuated by periods of destruction or reversal, was not considered incompatible with Plato's thought in antiquity. This more moderate form of cyclicity, it will be argued, can plausibly be attributed to Plato himself. The discussion begins with a set of interpretative problems: whether the myth should be read simply as a parody of traditional mythical motifs, such as autochthony myths or the idea of a golden age, or whether it is intended to be taken seriously. If it is to be taken seriously, then the further question arises of how literally it should be understood. Another issue concerns its relation to other cosmological passages in Plato, especially the creation account in the Timaeus, and whether such texts should be compared at all. Addressing these problems requires first clarifying the origin of the Cronus myth, its function within the Statesman, and possibly its broader significance within Plato's overall philosophical project. To proceed, the context of the myth in the Statesman must be considered. As is typical in Platonic dialogues, the myth is introduced at a moment of argumentative difficulty, although its importance extends beyond the immediate aim of defining statesmanship. This broader role is suggested by the Eleatic stranger at the beginning of the passage, when he presents the myth as a great story that should be largely incorporated into the discussion. The great myth in question is constructed from multiple traditional narratives. Some elements, such as the story of Atrus and Thyestes and myths of autochthony, are explicitly mentioned, while others are integrated more implicitly into the structure of the account. Among the implicit elements is Hesiod's myth of the races, which may represent one of the earliest expressions in Greek literature of a cyclical view of history or cosmic development. Although this interpretation of Hesiod is debated, it can be supported by a plausible reading of the text. On this view, the first three races, which progressively decline in quality, form a first cycle. The golden and silver races are created by the Olympian gods under Cronus, while the bronze race is produced under Zeus alone. The golden race lives in a condition comparable to that of the gods, free from suffering, and the earth spontaneously produces its fruits without cultivation. This idea, itself rooted in an earlier tradition, is reflected in Plato's description of the age of Cronus, not only in the Statesman but also in other dialogues. A second cycle begins with the divine race of heroes, the warriors associated with the Theban and Trojan wars. According to Hesiod, Zeus transports these heroes to the Isles of the Blessed, where they continue to live in a condition free from suffering under the rule of Cronus, forming a renewed golden age. Following the same pattern of decline, this heroic generation is succeeded by the inferior Iron race, the generation to which Hesiod and his contemporaries belong. Even so, this age still contains a mixture of good and evil elements. Yet an even worse generation is expected to follow, marking the final stage of the cycle. At the end of this sequence, when human beings are born already aged with grey hair, Zeus brings about their destruction, after which a new golden age is implied to begin, along with a new cycle. A further poetic tradition attributed to Hesiod, the Catalogue of Women, offers a condensed version of this scheme, describing the transition from the age of heroes, when gods and mortals intermingled and produced offspring, to the present age of humans. Unlike the Works and Days, this account does not explicitly suggest a future return to the heroic condition, although the text does not exclude such a possibility. It should nevertheless be emphasized that the interpretation of Hesiod's myth of the races as implying a cyclical structure remains controversial. Some scholars see Hesiod's wish that he had been born earlier or later than the fifth generation as an indication of future renewal within the cycle, while others interpret it simply as a rhetorical expression without cosmological implications. Hesiod is not the only pre-Platonic source to present the idea of cosmic ages or cyclical structures. Empedocles is well known for his doctrine of endlessly alternating cosmic phases, one governed by increasing love, also called Aphrodite, which brings unity out of separation, and another governed by increasing strife, which produces the opposite movement of division and differentiation. This twofold structure of Empedocles' cosmology is notably similar to the model found in Plato's Statesman, since both describe a recurring cycle composed of two opposed phases, one governed by a rational and productive force associated with order, growth, and harmony, and the other dominated by chaos, disintegration, and destruction. The influence of Empedocles' doctrine of love and strife on the myth in the Statesman is further supported by a passage in the Sophist, the central dialogue of the Theaetetus, Sophist, Statesman trilogy. There, the Eleatic stranger refers to various cosmological theories, including that of a Sicilian muse, according to whom the cosmos alternates between unity under the influence of Aphrodite and multiplicity driven by a form of strife. In the same context, the stranger also mentions two unnamed positions, one proposing three fundamental principles, and another proposing two opposing principles, such as wet and dry, or hot and cold, combined and unified in a kind of cosmic pairing or marriage. The theory of three principles has often been associated with Pherecydes of Samos, a thinker and mythographer of the 6th century before the Common Era with links to Orphic and Pythagorean traditions, who is said to have structured his cosmogony around three primordial divinities, Cronus, Thoni, and Zaz. The theory of paired opposites has been interpreted as referring to cosmologies that ultimately trace back to early presocratic thought, including traditions associated with Anaximenes, where basic physical oppositions such as hot and cold or wet and dry play a fundamental generative role. However, the stranger's earlier reference to myths and stories told to children suggests instead a mythological rather than strictly philosophical source. This points more plausibly to the author of a mythical cosmogony, such as one of the Orphic theogonies. Indeed, an Orphic tradition beginning with primordial elements such as water and mud, or water and the substance from which earth solidifies, is attested in later sources in what is known as the Hieronyman theogony. Although the precise dating of this tradition remains uncertain, parallels with Near Eastern mythological material suggest that its original form may go back as early as the 6th century before the Common Era. What is relevant for the present discussion is the presence of two distinct structural patterns within Orphic, or Orphic-adjacent, mythical traditions, one organized according to a tripartite model and another based on binary opposition, including the fundamental contrast between one and many. The binary structure is most clearly expressed in the idea of a continuous alternation between life and death, embodied in the doctrine of reincarnation and the cycle of rebirths. By contrast, the tripartite pattern is especially visible in cosmological contexts, for example in the association of Zeus with a threefold division of time, where he is described as the god who contains beginning, middle, and end. Another clear instance appears in the Orphic myth of the three races of humankind, known primarily through late Neoplatonic testimony. According to Proclus, the theologian Orpheus transmitted the existence of three human races: first the golden race, created by Fans; second the silver race, ruled by Cronus; and third the titanic race, formed by Zeus from the limbs of the Titans. In this scheme, every form of human life is understood as encompassed within these three defining stages. Because this testimony is relatively late and resembles Hesiod's myth of the five races, it is often assumed that the Orphic author adapted Hesiod's account, replacing Cronus with Fans as the ruler of the golden race and reworking the bronze race into the present human condition, understood as deriving from the Titans. However, an alternative explanation is also possible. Both Hesiod and the Orphic tradition may instead be drawing on an earlier stratum of mythic material, perhaps influenced by non-Greek or pre-Greek motifs, which already structured human history in three stages. A threefold metallic scheme is also found in later authors such as Aratus, although this is usually considered a simplified adaptation of Hesiod. Nevertheless, an independent tradition may be preserved in Babrius, in the prologue to his collection of Aesopic fables, where a sequence of golden, silver, and iron races appears. If a model of three metallic ages was already established in Greek tradition at an early stage, it becomes plausible that both Hesiod and the Orphic mythmakers adapted this inherited structure in different directions. Hesiod appears to have expanded the basic three-stage model by adding the heroic generation drawn from epic tradition and by transforming the final stage into the present age of iron, marked by moral decline. He also suggests, in a pessimistic tone, the possibility of an even worse future generation beyond his own. The Orphic tradition, by contrast, integrates the same tripartite structure into its cosmological framework by assigning the creation of the golden race to Fans, identifying the present human condition with a titanic element, and grounding human origin in the aftermath of the Titan's destruction. More detailed information about the Orphic Silver Age is given by Proclus in his Platonic theology, where he cites an Orphic fragment concerning Cronus in connection with the cosmological myth of Plato's Statesman. In this passage, Proclus explains that the theologians attribute agelessness to the order governed by Cronus, a belief also found among non-Greek traditions and in Orpheus, the Greek theologian. Orpheus is said to describe Cronus in a mystical way, stating that his hair remains eternally black and never turns grey. On this basis, Proclus expresses admiration for Plato's divinely inspired intellect, since Plato likewise depicts the cycle of Cronus as a time in which souls abandon old age and return to youth, with the white hair of the elderly turning black again. This corresponds, according to Proclus, to what is reported by the Eleatic stranger. Orpheus is also said to describe Cronus in similar terms, presenting him as a god who, under Zeus the son of Cronus, possesses immortal life. In this description, the flowing and fragrant hair of Cronus is said to remain untouched by the whiteness of old age, and instead he is depicted with thick, luxuriant hair around his temples. Although the precise meaning and original context of these verses remain uncertain, Proclus appears to suggest that Plato extends qualities attributed to Cronus in the Orphic tradition to the human beings living under his rule. West, following Kern's edition, argues instead that Proclus may have misinterpreted a pronoun that originally referred not to Cronus himself, but to his silver race. Whether one accepts Proclus' reading or prefers the reconstruction proposed by West and Kern, it remains plausible that, if these verses derive from an early Orphic poem, they could have influenced Plato's depiction in the Statesman of aging being reversed. This possibility is strengthened by the fact that Hesiod offers only a very limited parallel in a single obscure line from the myth of the races, which suggests that Zeus will eventually destroy humanity when people are born already with grey hair at their temples. With this consideration of sources, attention turns to the role of the myth within the Statesman itself and within Plato's wider philosophy. It is important that the Eleatic stranger introduces the account of the age of Cronus and the reversal of the cosmic cycle by explicitly emphasizing its mythical and playful character. This indicates that the myth is not intended as a literal cosmological explanation, but rather as a metaphor primarily designed to illustrate the nature of the true statesman. The explicit aim of the discussion is to distinguish mortal rulers, who govern other human beings, from divine rulers, who oversee humanity in the way that humans oversee livestock. In this analogy, only divine governance can properly be compared to the role of a shepherd. However, the conclusion reached through this extended mythological digression is relatively straightforward and does not appear to require such an elaborate narrative structure. As has been noted, the myth seems to function largely as a self-contained story, and the preliminary remarks about its playful character may serve to justify its apparent distance from the main argumentative thread of the dialogue. Even so, the broader significance of the statesman myth remains an open question. In order to address it, it is necessary to examine other passages in Plato's work where the age of Cronus or the idea of a golden age is invoked. The first occurrence appears in the eschatological myth at the end of the Gorgias, where the origin of post-mortem judgment of souls is explained. In this account, during the reign of Cronus, human beings were permitted to know in advance the time of their death and were judged immediately before dying by other living humans. At the beginning, these favorable conditions continued even under Zeus, but because people used them to evade punishment, Zeus, the son of Cronus, changed the system so that souls would instead be judged after death by divine judges. This narrative corresponds to what is presented in the myth of the statesman, where life in the age of Cronus is portrayed as easier and more just because of the direct governance of the gods. In both the Statesman and the Gorgias, the positive conditions of the earlier age continue into the age of Zeus until a gradual decline begins, caused by the material element, or until, in the case of the Gorgias, the inferior nature of human beings manifests itself through deception. The image of a superior golden race is given an allegorical interpretation in the Cratylus, where the term for daimons, which in Hesiod refers to the transformed members of the golden race after death, is reinterpreted as meaning knowing or wise. This reinterpretation aligns with the portrayal of Cronus as an embodiment of mind in the Davini commentary, where his name is explained as striking intellect. Such allegorical readings aim to purify traditional mythological accounts from elements considered inappropriate in the depiction of the gods, a concern strongly associated with Plato's philosophical project. Earlier in the Cratylus, Socrates, inspired by the mystic Euthyphro, similarly interprets the names of Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus, describing Cronus as a great intellect and linking his name to the purity of his thought. If, as Proclus suggests, Plato extended Cronus' agelessness to the human beings governed by him, it would also be natural for this extension to include Cronus' wisdom being attributed to the daimons. This connection may already be present in earlier tradition, as suggested by a Pindaric fragment quoted in the Meno, where those purified from ancient guilt are said to be reborn as glorious kings and men of exceptional wisdom. Returning to the Cratylus, Plato cites not only Hesiod but also other poets who claim that a good man, upon death, receives great honor and becomes a daimon. Among these poets are likely the anonymous authors of Orphic ritual texts, including those preserved on the gold tablets, which refer to the divine status attained by initiates after death. Orphic-influenced authors such as Pindar and Empedocles are also relevant here. Empedocles famously describes himself as a fallen daimon exiled for a vast number of seasons as punishment for a primordial crime, while Pindar speaks of the souls of the righteous, after repeated cycles of life, reaching the domain of Cronus in the Isles of the Blessed. Since Plato often uses mystery initiation as a metaphor for philosophical practice, the interpretation of daimon as wise fits coherently within this framework. This also adds further significance to a passage near the end of the Statesman myth, where the decline that follows the withdrawal of divine guidance is associated with forgetfulness. In a worldview shared by Plato and Orphic traditions, where virtue and salvation depend on knowledge, the loss of memory inevitably leads to corruption and ultimate ruin. As these passages show, the mythologem of the age of Cronus carries a profound religious significance for Plato, who employs it to represent an ideal condition in which the destructive power of the material element is held in check, and where sin and suffering are absent. This vision of a heaven on earth exists only as a poetic construct or thought experiment, comparable to the frequently misunderstood City of Pigs in Book 2 of the Republic, or, in essence, to memories of a distant past, as in the Laws, where an earlier age characterized by vegetarianism and an Orphic life is contrasted with a later time in which agriculture is absent and human beings resort to consuming other living creatures, including other humans, for survival. Although such ideal conditions cannot be realized in the present world and are accessible, at most, only in the afterlife for a select few, they nevertheless function as a normative model that the true statesman or philosopher king should attempt to reproduce as far as possible. This is made explicit in another passage of the Laws, which should be read alongside the myth of the statesman. There, the Athenian stranger recounts a most blessed government that existed under Cronus and served as a paradigm for the best contemporary constitutions. Tradition reports the happiness of human life in that age, when all things were abundant and grew spontaneously. The cause of this condition is said to have been that Cronus appointed as rulers not human beings, but a higher and more divine kind of beings, namely daimons, in the same way that humans now govern domesticated animals such as sheep and cattle. Just as humans do not place oxen over oxen or goats over goats, but rule over them themselves as a superior species, so too the god, in his benevolence toward humanity, set over human beings a nobler race of daimons. These daimons, governing with ease for themselves and benefit for humanity, ensured peace, moderation, order, and justice in abundance, and preserved human life free from conflict and filled with happiness. As explained in the Statesman, the blessed conditions enjoyed by humans and other living beings under Cronus result from the direct supervision of the world by perfectly rational and good rulers, namely gods and daimons. For this reason, any state ruled by mortals will inevitably experience some degree of hardship and injustice. Even so, good statesmen and lawgivers are required to imitate this divine model as far as human capacity allows, ordering their households and cities in accordance with the immortal element within themselves. In this perspective, as Plato indicates in the myth of metals in the Republic, the rulers of the ideal city will belong to a renewed golden race. Furthermore, in a later discussion of the Republic, those who die gloriously in battle are honored as daimons, and their graves become objects of reverence. As already observed by Cornford, the parallel between this passage and the etymological link between daimons and knowing beings in the Cratylus, where a modified version of Hesiod is cited, suggests that Plato had in mind the mythological guardian spirits when naming the rulers of Callipolis as guardians. This connection implies that the golden-souled rulers of the myth of metals correspond to a divine model of protection and guidance. It is also significant that the distinction between the guardians proper and their auxiliaries is introduced near the end of Book 3 of the Republic, immediately before the myth of metals. This distinction is necessary in order to preserve the correspondence between the social structure of Callipolis and the metallic races of Hesiod's myth, in which the bronze and iron races are merged into a single category so as to maintain the parallel with the tripartite structure of the soul. Nevertheless, throughout the dialogue, the term guardians continues to be used in a flexible manner, sometimes referring to the entire ruling and military class, and at other times designating specifically the philosopher kings, depending on the context. The close connection between the golden and silver classes, which arguably strains the analogy with the tripartite division of the soul, where the rational part stands on one side and the spirited and appetitive parts on the other, finds a parallel in the Orphic myth of the races. In that tradition, the silver race is presented in a far more positive light than in Hesiod's version, at least according to Proclus' testimony. In his commentary on Hesiod's Works and Days, the Neoplatonic philosopher reports that, in Orpheus' account, Cronus rules over the silver race, and that those who live in accordance with pure reason are called silver, while those who live in accordance with intellect alone are called golden. Without necessarily projecting Proclus' allegorical interpretation, clearly shaped by Platonic thought, back onto the Orphic sources themselves, it remains tempting to connect Plato's analogy between city and soul with the Orphic myth of the three human races. If the antiquity of this myth were established, a strong case could be made for its influence, at least in part, on Plato's conception of the age of Cronus, which appears to combine Hesiod's golden age with elements drawn from the Orphic understanding of the silver race. It should now be evident that the narrative of Cronus in the Statesman is not a superficial digression from the serious philosophical inquiry into the nature of the statesman, but rather a mythic articulation of a foundational principle underlying Plato's ethical and political thought, that in any properly ordered whole, whether a city, an individual soul, or the cosmos itself, the divine and rational element must govern what is by nature irrational and disorderly. The question then arises as to the cosmological dimension of the myth. The reversal of planetary motion is almost certainly a narrative device used to anchor the story within established mythic traditions, linking it to tales such as that of Atrus and to Greek myths of autochthony. However, the idea of eternally recurring cosmic cycles is fully compatible with Plato's broader worldview. Throughout his work, cyclicality functions as a universal principle governing nearly all aspects of existence. This is most clearly illustrated in the Phaedo, where Socrates develops the cyclical argument in support of reincarnation and the soul's immortality. The same cycle of growth and decay that governs individual beings also operates at the level of societies, as shown in the accounts of civilizational decline in the Timaeus and the Laws. Since the universe itself is conceived as a living physical being, it follows that it too is subject to processes of degeneration. Yet, because it was created by God in the image of an eternal model, only God possesses the power to destroy it. As the myth in the Statesman explains, the natural tendency of the cosmos toward disorder, rooted in its material composition, requires periodic divine intervention, in which God dissolves and renews creation. This cyclical structure of the cosmos, which also offers a solution to the problem of how both virtuous and irredeemably wicked souls might permanently escape reincarnation, is also suggested in the Timaeus, where reference is made to a perfect year. The same notion of a cosmic period appears in a difficult passage of the Republic, where Plato speaks of a cycle of divine generation enclosed by a perfect number. The precise value of this number has been debated since antiquity. One papyrus identifies it with Heraclitus' great year of 10,800 years, while Censorinus reports different calculations under what Aristotle calls the great year, including a version attributed to Orpheus of 120,000 years. It is impossible to determine with certainty how long Plato thought the perfect year lasted. What does appear clear, however, is that Plato was drawing on an ancient tradition of cosmic cyclicity that ultimately has its roots in an Orphic background. Through a close examination of the myth in the Statesman and its broader role within the Platonic corpus, it can be shown that the central ideas expressed there, concerning the relation between God and the physical world and the cyclical structure of time, should not be treated as marginal, but rather as the culmination of recurring religious and philosophical motifs that run throughout Plato's work. Attention has also been drawn to the close link between cosmology and politics, grounded in the analogy between macrocosm and microcosm, which shapes Plato's reflections not only in the Statesman, but also in the Laws and, as discussed earlier, in the Timaeus. It is true that a basic understanding of a text or system can be reached without detailed knowledge of its author or historical context, but a deeper form of understanding requires knowledge of origins. Just as Aristotle's relationship to Plato and the Academy is essential for interpreting his philosophy, and Plato's relationship with Socrates is likewise fundamental, Orpheism should be seen as an equally important, if not greater, influence on Plato's intellectual development. Furthermore, several central features of Plato's thought, such as his emphasis on eschatology, his strong rejection of the body and the material world, his concern with moral purification and the salvation of the soul, and his conception of philosophy as a practice of death, cannot be properly understood outside the Orphic framework in which they are rooted. Ignoring this religious and specifically mystical foundation inevitably leads to a distorted and overly simplified interpretation of his philosophy. Finally, the examination of the cultural background of the Timaeus creation narrative highlights the innovative character of Orphic cosmogonic and anthropogonic myths. For the first time in Greek thought, these myths present the world as the result of divine intelligent design, and human nature as inherently composite, originating from the combination of two opposing principles. Throughout the study, a substantial reinterpretation of Plato's philosophical development has been proposed, leading to a deeper understanding of the Platonic corpus and a reassessment of Orpheism's role in ancient religion and philosophy.